Women's Equality Day all day long, and we are nearing the end of our celebration, or the beginning of our suffragist party. And I am here with Angela Beddoe, and you have been such a pivotal pillar of beaming light to keep me on course, staying focused, and continuing this mission that I've set out to do and support women in career and in life. And so I wanted to give you the floor, basically, to share and dispel some wisdom on us.
Well, thanks so much, Catherine, and it's great to be here live at the not-so-secret garden of Palette Cafe as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment passing, which is a very important time for women. And so I really do appreciate you and the Palette team for all you've done for women in this community as well. And when you and I were talking about today, and I was telling you that, what I really wanted to chat about was taking a look back in history for this and where we're going in the future. And so I have a few prepared remarks, if you don't mind,
Of course.
that I'd just like to give, and while all these wonderful women are sitting around, so I'll be talking to you all, if that's great, good for you. But I just wanted to kind of say that the struggle, inspiration, and achievements of the suffragist movement is the exact formula stories that we strive to bring at HerLife magazine. And as editor and publisher of HerLife magazine, it's really important that we tell her story and inspire women to go forward out into this world with a zest to make their own stories and create their own dreams. And when I reflect on the suffragist movement, I think about one her story in particular, and that's the story of my mom, Rita. And she grew up during the Depression, World War II, segregationist Jim Crow laws, and civil rights and the Voting Rights Bill. And my mother was a person of color, and her story is about exercising her right to vote. Even when she was in her late 80s, she always insisted on going to the polling place and making sure that she voted. Voting for her was not just in the moment. For her, it was honoring a legacy of women and a civil rights movement that fought and insisted on her right and every human's rights to exist with dignity and possess the same rights. So her story was a story of making sure that her kids understood that voting was a right and that it was a duty and an honor for those who came before us on the shoulders that we stand. There are so many great women in history attached to the suffragist movement, and I thank them all for their effort and passion. But the story of the suffragists was twofold. The movement itself did not include, in fact, it often excluded black women. Yes, we have moments in time with people like Sojourner Truth giving her Ain't I a Woman speech back in 1851, but we also saw moments in time when black women were not invited to the meeting, for example. With the infamous suffragist march that took place in 1913 in Washington, D.C., black women were actually told to march in the back of the line. They were told to go to the back. In order to ratify the 19th Amendment, it was important that Southern white women were supportive so that they would have strength in numbers. And many of those Southern women were also members of the Daughters of the Confederacy and were reluctant to join the movement out of fear that black women would be able to vote. In spite of all of this insider intrigue, the 19th Amendment passed. And after the passing of the amendment, the story did not end. You see, this story was only the beginning. Although women won the right to vote, they continue to be disenfranchised, especially black women. So for me, her story is the story of Mary McLeod Bethune, a black woman who lived in Florida and organized other black women to register and exercise their right to vote despite oftentimes violent opposition. One time on election eve, the school she ran for girls was surrounded by the Ku Klux Klan. And they were trying to intimidate her and other black women from voting. And Mary McLeod Bethune stood strong, and because of her example, black women proceeded to the polls. Her story is the story of Helen Appo Cook, who funded the Colored Women's League in 1892 and fought for black suffrage and held night classes so women could further empower and educate themselves and eventually be able to be registered to vote. Her story is the story of Ida B. Wells, a pioneering journalist who founded a black women's suffragist club in Chicago and registered thousands of black women to vote. Notably, this year she was posthumously awarded the Pulitzer Prize for her stories against violence against African Americans. Her story is Mary Church Terrell, who established the National Association of Colored Women, a black suffrage group who supported the movement and encouraged black women to find their power. She too used the power of journalism and to spread the message. Even after the 19th Amendment was ratified, there were many states who came up with laws to disempower and disenfranchise all women, but black people, and especially black women, from voting. And yet they persisted. Her story is the story of Savannah, Georgia, where a lot of my family is from. And after the ratification of the amendment targeted and turned black women away from voting because by state law they had to have registered 6 months before in advance. And according to the press at that time, they knew what they were doing targeting black women to try to stop them from voting because they knew that no southern white woman would present themselves at the polls. Her story is the story of the large number of black women who showed up in 1920 in Kent County, Delaware, to vote but were turned away because they failed to comply with constitutional tests. Her story is the story of being unable to pass literacy tests or pay poll taxes and being denied the right to vote. And yet, they still persisted. Her story is Rosa Parks, who many of us remember her for her refusal to get on the back of the bus. But Rosa Parks was a pioneer long before she refused to get on the back of the bus. She was a pioneer in the movement for women's rights. And part of that voting rights were for people of color. In fact, that civil rights movement closed the gap of disenfranchisement and offered more rights to voters, eventually leading to the Voting Rights Bill of 1965. We all know that history is messy. My reason for sharing this perspective with you is because all of these women are intertwined with any one of them, regardless of skin color. We would not be where we are today. But that was only the beginning. And today we see glimmers of history repeating itself. Today, voting rights are being toyed with, whether it's the Supreme Court decision of 2013 that rolled back some parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or the closing of polling places, the purging voter rolls in some states, like the governor's race in Georgia, where the Secretary of State was a white male and he was running for governor. And this is 2019. He purged 75,000 voters out of the tax rolls. He ran against a black woman, Stacey Abrams. He only won that election by 55,000 votes. Or we see the encumbrances put upon us by the postal system when mail-in ballots today are ever so more important. One of the things these ladies, these suffragists did is that they kept their foot on the gas. From the 1850s to the 1920s, they kept their foot on the gas. And then the civil rights movement kept the foot on the gas, resulting in landmark legislation with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And what do we need to do now to keep our feet on the gas? Well, we have to ask ourselves what our story will be 100 years from now. So one year, I'll go back to my mother. When I was taking my mother to vote at the polling place, she was in her 80s. She met a young black girl at the polling place who was 15 or 16 years old. And she was there with her mom. And my mother spent a lot of time with her, telling her about the importance of voting, the legacy of a black woman, why she should exercise her right to vote when she legally could be able to do so. So a few years later, I'm taking my mom back there. Now she's in her later 80s on election day. And oh my God, there this girl was. And she was 18 and she was ready to vote. That young lady who turned 18 voted for the first time, and she hugged my mother and took a picture with her. My mother was her inspiration to register and exercise her right to vote. Even in her 80s, my mother kept her foot on the gas. So I encourage you, when you go out there, as we leave Palette Cafe and as we celebrate today, just in your